and out of mind. And that covers a lot more territory than you might have realized. We'll start with the Idaho budget fight. In fact, a budgetary coup of sorts took place over the last few days. We'll tell you a little bit more about that. We'll talk a little bit about why it is that conservative voters always seem to be a little bit underrepresented in terms of those legislators who claim, well, no, I'm a Republican too. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about how that problem, the non-existent problem of illicit material being presented to kids in school libraries, how bad could it go if we just ignored it? If you want to know the answer, we've got the answer coming up for you in Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. We start with, first of all, an observation on the nature of government, and this helps us understand a little bit better the actions of the people in government. I don't want to suggest that they are uniquely evil or uniquely ill-informed. They're people, meaning they're subject to human nature. So I want to start with a quote from Paul Rosenberg about status. He notes that our present world is dominated by status-based structures. And whether we're talking about a kingdom or a democracy or whatever, status-based structures set one man or group of men above all others. People of a higher position collect the production of the lower people. They issue edicts for them to obey and punish those who do not. I realize that's probably the least flattering way you've ever heard, representative government described. But there is a ring of truth to that. And wait until you see what has happened in terms of I guess what others are calling. I'm going to go with Brian Allman's definition of this: the budgetary coup that was taking place in the Idaho legislature just a few days ago. Now, I have to give strong recommendation to the Gem State Chronicle and Brian. He's not only a very keen observer, meaning he pays attention to the details, but in my opinion, Brian is one of the fairest voices out there, meaning he really will try to see it from as many sides as possible and is not so much interested in steering you into the appropriate conclusion or correcting your thinking, but giving you enough facts that you can make a reasonable judgment for yourself. Strange, isn't that what mainstream media used to do or still thinks that it does, but somehow just can't deliver on? So let's talk about this budgetary coup that took place. And this is what Brian Allman reports in the Gem State Chronicle. He says, as far as the Idaho Constitution is concerned, the legislature has one job: fund the government. They can ignore every other bill that's introduced, but they cannot adjourn the session until they have passed a balanced budget. So the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, or JFAC as you will often hear it called, is composed of 10 senators and 10 representatives who create the budgets that the legislature must pass. Senator C. Scott Grow, the current co-chair of JFAC, has said that when he was first appointed to the Joint Committee, he wondered why he was there. As far as he could tell, JFAC simply rubber-stamped the budget requests it received from the governor. By the way, that's how a lot of governing is done. That's how a lot of legislative appropriations are done. Oh, you sent us the budget? Well, great. Let's just stamp that. Sometimes that's a little too cozy of a working relationship, as you're going to see. Now, Senator Grow wanted to do things differently this year. He wanted to reclaim the legislature's authority as a co-equal branch of government. And so he worked with fellow co-chair Representative Wendy Horman, to split agency budgets into two parts. So the first is the maintenance budget. That's the appropriations required to keep the lights on and the doors open. As I understand it, the maintenance budget is essentially, what did it take to run your department last year? The second is the line item increases. In other words, that's the wish list from the governor and hundreds of agencies that make up our government. So with that in mind, Brian Allman says, this is actually a pretty great idea. The problem with the old way of doing things are twofold. First, JFAC tended to present all the budgets at once near the end of the session when legislators are itching to go home. Now, this effect is even more pronounced in election years when lawmakers want to hit the campaign trail. So that puts tremendous pressure on legislators to simply vote yes and hit the road rather than seriously debating each one of those more than 100 budget bills that they had to consider. All right, now you can't blame them. That's just human nature. We've been here long enough. Let's just pass this and get it done. It must be important or it wouldn't be in the budget. Second, Brian points out, by including maintenance and line item increases in the same budget, fiscal conservatives faced a tough choice. If they voted for the budget, then they're simply rubber stamping the governor's requests. But if they voted against because they disagreed with spending increases, well, then their opponents accuse them of trying to defund the police or other essential services. See how that game is played? And so he says, splitting the budget solved both problems at once. JFAC finished the maintenance budgets just a few weeks into the session and sent them to the House and Senate floors. Now, this meant that the legislature would be able to fulfill their duty to fund the government while leaving plenty of time to debate requests for increases. Fiscal conservatives could also cheerfully vote for the maintenance budgets while rejecting the increases. It sounds great, doesn't it? And Brian asks, who could disagree with the new process? Well, as it turns out, there are quite a few naysayers. Wait till you see who they are, though. He says, despite every Republican on JFAC voting in favor of the maintenance budgets last month, on Friday morning, 9 Republicans joined with 3 Democrats to pass new budgets that include both the maintenance portion and the spending increases. In other words, indistinguishable. Not only did they spring this coup on Senator Groh at the last minute, but they also did so on a day when Representative Horman was out sick. So here's an example of what happened on Friday morning. Senator Scott Herndon introduced a budget for the Board of Tax Appeals that included only the new spending increases. However, Representative Rod Furness and Senator Kevin Cook made a substitute motion to introduce the full Board of Tax Appeals budget, including both the maintenance portion, which had already passed, as well as the new increases. Do you see how they did that? So he puts up an interesting graphic in this story, which I'm only showing you a portion of it, but the tally you see on the right remained the same for every vote. In other words, 9 Republicans and 3 Democrats joined forces to undo all the hard work of Senator Groh and Representative Horman. And in the aftermath of the coup, Representative Josh Tanner spoke with Matt Edwards on Idaho Signal about what had just happened and summed it up perfectly with one quote. There's a lot of people out there that don't want transparency within government. It makes them extremely nervous. And it should make you a little bit perturbed, or at least interested, right? Now, Brian Allman says, look, this raises some very pertinent questions. And one of the things that was brought up was, would Governor Little work behind the scenes to kill the new budget process if he thought his launch program was in danger? That's kind of a feather in his cap, so it's a fair question. How long have the Main Street Republicans been planning the coup they unleashed on Friday? Did they meet secretly prior to Friday's committee hearing? Was Senator Winder involved with the coup? It's likely he had a hand in keeping the maintenance budgets from reaching the Senate floor for more than 2 weeks. Was he holding them long enough to allow for the coup to take shape? One thing you have to know is Senator Winder has been extremely quiet about all of this. So if he has a problem with it, he's certainly not saying so. And if he doesn't have a problem with it, he's probably just going, well, it went exactly as planned. Last question, what role have the other members of the House and Senate leadership played? Where are Representatives Megan Blanksma and Senator Kelly Anthon on this issue? So, yeah, would you rather have, the back and forth and the scrutiny and, do we really need to make these extra appropriations while at the same time making sure that they have their maintenance budgets in place, by separating the two? See, to me, that makes sense. But then again, I'm the kind of person who takes seriously. I want government to be funded well enough to do its job, but not so well funded that it's plundering me in order to do that. I hope that makes sense. I want responsibility. I want people to be frugal. I want them, if they can save me and the other taxpayers' money, then I want them to do that. That's responsible governance. But so much of this takes place out of sight. And so it's just odd to me that the powers that be, the ones who are entrenched, the establishment, rhino Republicans, they really don't like this. And perhaps it's because it sheds a little too much light on what they're doing, or it offers a little too clear of a glimpse as to where their partnerships and therefore their allegiances actually lie. Now, Brian Allman says, look, this is about as clear-cut a battle of good and evil as you're going to find in the legislative process. Senator Groh and Representative Horman came up with an idea to increase transparency, to rein in spending, and slow the growth of government. And now you have this cadre of lawmakers working behind the scenes to undermine this idea. Now, Brian says, at least it's clear to those of us who are plugged into the session. But he points out regular voters don't often see the minute details or grasp the significance of what's happened. And I would add to that the mainstream media is saying very, very little about this other than, oh, well, yes, they're working out those budget problems. And anything they say will be favorable to the more spending, bigger government side. So it's imperative to understand who is working against us at the Capitol, says Brian Allman. Every Republican, even the moderates, claim a desire to stop growing government and to rein in spending. Yet here's a whole crew working in secret to resume unfettered growth and spending increases. Now, if that doesn't make your stomach hurt just a little bit, I don't think you're paying close enough attention, because that's a very real problem. And the fact it's being done, well, we just pulled this arcane rule out that we can seize control of this committee and undo this. My question is not so much, okay, that's human nature. That's politicians protecting their territory. What about you as a citizen? Is that good enough? Would you accept that as, well, what's a person to do? What are we going to, well, first of all, don't accept that kind of bad behavior. Don't accept that kind of a way to duck transparency. Now, this is from Brian's Gem State Substack, but he makes an observation here that, a lot of people who it's out of sight, out of mind, therefore they're really not concerned. He says, I don't want to believe that we've lost sight of why people legislate in the first place. He says, I think there are a lot of voters who understand the full context. They just don't understand where to start. So that's why we need an alternative media ecosystem here in Idaho. And Brian is doing his best to share as much information as he can. He says, I know others are doing the same, but we need more. We need printed newspapers, regular video programs, radio, mailers, etc. He says there are a lot of good conservatives who are fooled by the narrative because they're too busy working, raising families, living their lives. There are a lot of good conservatives who ignore politics because they don't think it can make a difference. But he says the truth is we can, but it takes work and it takes numbers. So let's work and raise the discourse and raise up a generation of conservatives who know what time it is, who know what's at stake, and are willing to work to save it. Let's end the era of politics being about nothing more than platitudes, which is what those politicians who are fighting transparency and openness, that's what they're for. They want to be able to do what they do quietly and out of sight. And don't you worry your pretty little head about it. We'll just, you keep me in office and I'll keep good things happening for you. I think that's kind of how those promises go. All right, moving along. We've heard talk about, this unnecessary library bill. And by the way, there is still some back and forth going on. In fact, there was a compromise bill that was introduced that sounded like it could actually address some of the concerns here. But what if we were just to ignore it and pretend like it doesn't happen? Surely it wouldn't grow into a big problem. Guess again. Brandon Durst alerts us, why do we need to do something about obscene materials in libraries? Because if we don't, this will end up in Idaho. The trajectory of history is clear as day. The right compromises, the left pushes on, and eventually what used to be a shared societal norm becomes the subject of unrelenting criticism from the left, media, corporations, etc., for being far right. Now, this is in response to a story that broke a couple of days ago from libs of TikTok. Democrats in New Jersey introduced Senate Bill 2421. Orwell would love this, the Freedom to Read Act, which would create an exemption for obscenity laws for minors to exclude teachers and librarians and award monetary compensation to teachers and librarians who are criticized. It's not enough that you have teachers openly, and by the way, libs of TikTok, they don't embellish these videos. They'll just show you this is what this teacher, this educator posted. Himself, theirself, she-self, herself, they-self, whatever. And it's crazy how many of them will just openly admit, yes, we are here to make sure that the LGBTQ plus message is being taught to these kids. That's not being taught, it's being indoctrinated. And these young kids are being indoctrinated with crazy stuff. So here's the text, just a brief overview of the text from New Jersey. Okay, promoting obscene material, any person who knowingly sells, distributes, rents, or exhibits to a person under 18 years of age obscene material is guilty of a crime of the third degree. That's a person who knowingly shows obscene material to a person under 18 with the purpose or knowledge to arouse, gratify, or stimulate himself or another is guilty of a crime of the third degree if the person showing the obscene material is at least 4 years older than the person under 18 years of age viewing the material. Okay, I think that's pretty reasonable. Normal people would say that seems appropriate. But here's what the new legislation would offer is an affirmative defense to a prosecution under subsection B that the defendant is a teaching staff member, including a school library and media specialist, who is engaged in the performance of the person's duties and complying with whatever the policy may be. It is an affirmative of defense to prosecution under subsection B that the defendant is a staff member of a public library, including a librarian employed by a public library who's engaged in the performance of the person's duties and otherwise complying with the law. And then here's this part. If the school library media specialist or other teaching staff member that engages in activities as required by sections 4 through 6 of the pertinent code pending before the legislature as of this bill, if they're the prevailing party in the civil cause of action, in other words, if someone sues them for providing this salacious material to young minds, the school library media specialist or teaching staff member shall be entitled to an award of any reasonable attorney's fees and costs of suit incurred, and any injunctive relief as the court may deem necessary to avoid the defendant's continued violation. It's a free pass to give your kids books designed to break their minds and to entice them to question their very identity. And I'm sorry, the people who are trying to promote this, but we're just trying to help these kids, Brian. I don't think you are. And you wouldn't need to shame people, and you wouldn't need to try to capture the force of law and capture institutions to try to get that point across if you really could sell it on its own merits, but you can't. That's why you are reduced to crying bigot and homophobe at anybody who says, hey, this is not normal. Leave my kids alone and stop trying to show them stuff. Okay, on a lighter note, just so you'll know, being normal is not enough to avoid criticism. I thought this was pretty funny. Just the headline from KTVB: controversial podcast host Joe Rogan signs a new deal with Spotify for up to a reported $250 million. How dare he succeed without the permission of the chattering class? But I do like Representative Heather Scott's observation here. Yeah, if you're in the majority, you're labeled controversial these days, which, Joe Rogan's audience, even the major mainstream networks can only dream of having an audience a fraction of the size of his podcast audience. Oh, well, karma is exact. And so that's a happier note to end on. Just keep in mind, just because it's out of sight doesn't mean it should be out of mind. Really get more plugged into the session. By the way, idahofreedom.org, if you want to read some really good line by line recounting of why the budgets are made the way they are, who is really out there trying to save you money as well as preserve your freedoms from people who think that government's prerogative is to make sure that they're issuing the right edicts and forcing you to obey them. Nope. You've got people who are serious about your freedom. You and we've got to be more serious about it ourselves. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see.
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this